Welcome to the 19th lecture of the course on sociological perspectives on modernity. In the last lecture, we have discussed Immanuel Wallerstein's reflections on synthesizing modernity and social theory, and then we have discussed the distinctions between modernity on the one hand and postmodernism on the other. And such distinctions between modernism and postmodernism, such distinctions between modernity and postmodernism have significant implications for the ways in which Anthony Giddens and Jürgen Habermas have tried to reflect on critical modernist paradigm in sociology. When we look at, let us first start with Giddens, then we will move on to Habermas. These themes, these distinctions between modernity and postmodernism, the kind of themes that we have already discussed in the last lecture. Okay. These themes are illustrated through discussions of various kinds of social forces, micropolitics and so on, although there is still a curiously abstract level to the discussion, especially about active or reflexive selves. Because for modernists, the self is active and reflexive, but for postmodernists, the self is dissolved and dismembered. Okay? The implications for sociology are drawn in such a manner. Sociology is part of the reflexivity of modernity, but it needs to be reformed to take into account the time space manipulations, time space distanciations and dimensions of late modernity. Okay? For example, we need to look beyond the nation state as a model of society. Processes of differentiation. Nation state, why I say that it is a model of society, because precisely because such nation states were also conceptualized against the backdrop of the process of decolonization, okay? Anti-colonial movements, anti-imperialist movements. Processes of differentiation that have been identified by earlier theorists need to be replaced with concepts of embedding and disembedding, which would widen into account of the whole subsequent dialectic operating between risk and trust, faceless and face-to-face commitments. Okay? In this context, Giddens is extremely important. Giddens' notion of the problem of order. What is the problem of order? The problem of order is also the problem of modernity, the constituents of modernity. It is the problem of order is one of the constituents of modernity. The problem of order for Giddens is one of time-space distanciation. In that, time and space are ordered in modernity to connect presence and absence. Secondly, these time-space separations or distanciations produce disembedding of traditional forms of relationships, dismembering of traditional forms of relationships, as standard and abstract dimensions of space and time come to as standard and abstract dimensions of space and time come to order and rationalize activities in the place of local contexts. Examples include the use of a timetable to coordinate going on a journey by car or plane. Such organizations also clearly involve reflexive accounts of past activities, and disembedding both lifts out social relations from local contexts of interaction and restructures them across indefinite spans of time and space. And this is a better way of describing what has happened compared to concepts of social differentiation, which are evolutionist in nature. Suppose we have discussed in the context of Weber, for example. Okay? Selection is based on cultural relevance, but if our cultural artifacts will change, our selection processes will also undergo transformation. Thirdly, such disembedding mechanisms require the creation of symbolic tokens, require certain representations. Through what? Especially through wealth, through money, defined as mechanisms to control time and space. They also, such disembedding mechanisms also lead to the establishment of expert systems, and these disembed further because they provide abstract guarantees of expectations across time and space. And what do I mean by this? I mean these impersonal tests and public forms further stretch social systems. They also imply a different kind of trust. Then what is trust? For Giddens, trust is defined fairly extensively. To summarize it, trust arises from the lack of full information, absolute information, lack of absolute information. Trust connotes reliability in the face of contingency. Trust operates as a link between faith and confidence. Trust involves principles rather than relying on the morality of others. Trust develops confidence in the reliability of a person or system. Trust takes on a more calculative form in modernity. Everyday life is more reflexive for Giddens, so that many people already know something of more specialist areas such as official statistics on divorce, for example, population, for example, and it would not be at all unusual to find a coroner who had read Durkheim, organic solidarity, mechanical solidarity. What is solidarity? For Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, solidarity means assemblage of people in the performance of rituals, that is solidarity. Okay? And if I say assemblage of people in the performance of rituals refers to solidarity, then everyday life becomes both sociologized as well as psychologized. Okay? Therein lies the significance of the term difference that we have discussed in the last lecture, when difference by Derrida, not difference but difference. Okay, that's a French term coined by Derrida. That's a central concept in Derrida's deconstruction. That is a critical outlook concerned with the relationship between text and meaning. Our everyday life becomes sociologized as well as psychologized. Okay, that the relationship between text and meaning. Okay, that's how difference also refers to conceptual differentiation and deferral of meaning in processes of signification. Difference also refers simultaneously to the entire configuration of its meanings. And for according to Anthony Giddens, anti-foundationalism or epistemological crisis in postmodernism is dismissed as inchoate, if pushed to appear as a theory or a mere description of a normal part of modernity. For Giddens, modernity coming to understand itself or fuller understanding of reflexivity inherent in modernity itself. Giddens further claims that it expresses an awareness which is widespread, anxieties which press in on everyone. Okay, this is very important. Okay, that epistemological crisis is dismissed. Modernity, according to Giddens, can thus be described as the greater and greater use of disembedding mechanisms to organize social life. However, there is also considerable re-embedding involving the pinning down of disembedding mechanisms to local contexts again. How does it happen? This happens when relations of trust are also formed by face work commitments and face-to-face commitments, and as a more generalized trust in abstract system develops, even where these involve faceless commitments. Okay. Goffman's work is cited here on the relationships which develop between strangers and how they are managed. Okay. Goffman's method is known as dramaturgical approach. Okay. It is a micro-sociological theory, micro-sociological approach to understand society. Okay. In our day-to-day life, okay, even our actions, even if we do not speak, okay, still we can relate to each other. Suppose I am delivering a lecture now and some students, okay, they just lean forward and they nod their head. Then it reflects, even if they do not say anything, but it reflects their seriousness and attentiveness. Okay, for Giddens, sorry, not for Giddens, but for Goffman's dramaturgical approach. Giddens also tells us that the personal and impersonal are deeply intertwined in everyday life, and relations of trust are always ambivalent. Confidence is required because there is a fundamental ignorance of the social world, but that implies that trust is largely a matter of making pragmatic connections based on past experiences. Okay. However, there is another dimension to it based on a general ontological security, which arises in early childhood as a result of definite child rearing practices, and some child psychology is summarized, such as Erikson. If somebody wants to study on child psychology and so on, child rearing, ontological security and so on, please go through Erikson's writings. For Giddens, traditional and modern cultures can be contrasted in terms of how they create environments of trust and risk. Giddens shows how the traditional social bonds such as kinship, community and religion can be seen as devices to organize environments of trust, while the characteristic environments of modernity are seen as personal relationships, abstract systems, future oriented counterfactual thinking and a perception of threats not from nature, war or the gods, but from the greater reflexivity of modernity, as we are part of it. We are not isolated from our economy, culture and polity. That is why there is a greater threat from the greater reflexivity of modernity, industrialized war and personal meaninglessness. I mean, the chance is missed here perhaps to sketch the dangers of excessive reflexivity. Okay? This is very important. Okay? I mean, the way Giddens tried to posit his argument that traditional and modern cultures can be contrasted in terms of how they create environments of trust and risk. Okay? I mean, the characteristic environments of modernity are seen as personal relationships, abstract systems, future oriented counterfactual thinking and a perception of threats not from nature or war or the gods, supernatural forces, but from the greater reflexivity of modernity, industrialized war, personal meaninglessness and so on. In this context, according to Giddens, the adaptive mechanisms to these perceptions of risk and threat are common to both expert as well as lay people. Expertise rapidly runs into the limits of the predictability of the world, and this can produce a pragmatic acceptance and an interest in surviving. As Last has suggested that this can produce some kind of numbness and deep anxiety within. An alternative coping mechanism is sustained optimism based on faith in reason or in God or supernatural, either reasoning capacity or superstition. And the third possibility is cynical pessimism, where people cope with risks by using black humor, the celebration of anachronism and so on as a way of coping with pessimism as such. And finally, there is the possibility of radical political engagement in various social movements. Giddens seems to have missed out retreatism and innovation, of course, the development of illegal activity as in criminal careers. He has added sustained optimism and cynical pessimism. And for Giddens, trust is extremely important, trust is crucial to modern life. Okay? Trust is very important to modern life, and trust is intertwined with the growth of globalization. Trust on a more personal level is best seen as a project, something to be worked at, involving a mutual process of self-disclosure. Giddens focuses on erotic involvement here, especially the romantic love complex. He also takes on Lassalle's gloomier view of an increasing manipulation and powerlessness, the result of a growing menacing appearance of the contemporary world. This seems reminiscent of Bauman's insistence that only pure or we relations offer hope in modernity. Bauman, if somebody wants to read, please we can go through Bauman's writings. Okay. According to Giddens, globalization leads to displacement of the old embedding mechanisms and a possible re-embedding in a whole dialectic of displacement and re-embedding, intimacy and impersonality, expertise and reappropriations, privatism and engagement. Okay. These are the characteristic features of critical modernist paradigm in sociology for Giddens. Okay. I mean, globalization leads to displacement of the old embedding mechanisms and a possible re-embedding with our economic culture and polity, the self, active and reflexive self and so on, in a whole dialectic of displacement and re-embedding, intimacy and impersonality, expertise and reappropriations, privatism and engagement. Okay. Referring to Habermas, we are going to discuss Jürgen Habermas a little while later, I mean within 5-10 minutes. Okay. Referring to Habermas, what Giddens suggested that expert systems do not colonize life worlds. In Habermas's term, it is known as Lebenswelt. Okay. Continually reappropriated by lay agents. Thus, expertise continually filters back into the life world, certainly a welcome attempt to modernize the concept of the life world in Habermas. Finally, for Giddens, modernity institutionalizes the world of doubt, not certainty. Okay? That is very important. I mean, the proponents of theology, the proponents of metaphysics, they always try to institutionalize certainty. Okay? Now, we have made a transition from the world of certainty to a world of doubt. Similarly, for Giddens, modernity institutionalizes not certainty but doubt. We have not developed a new postmodernist phase, but rather a complex meaning of presence and absence, okay? The problem of order, the problem of time and space distanciation, okay? Not primarily an expression of cultural fragmentation or of the dissolution of the subject into a world of science. Rather, the experience of modernity arises from a simultaneous transformation of subjectivity and global social organization against a troubling backdrop of high consequence risks. It is very important to look at the time space distanciation. I mean, what is the relationship between structure and agency? We have discussed in the context of Marx, in the context of Weber, in the context of Levi-Strauss and Althusser, in the context of Western Marxists and so on. What is the relationship between structure and agency for Giddens? Therein lies the significance of structuration theory. He talks about the way he dwells upon the relationship between structure and agency. I mean, structure and agency do not constitute some sort of dualism, rather they constitute some sort of duality. Duality of the structure means practices, human practices or practices of the agency are both the medium as well as the outcome of the structure that we have today. I mean, thereby he tries to place place agency on a higher pedestal vis-a-vis structure. Okay? This is one way to understand. Okay? One way of reading structure. But But if you ask Giddens is alive even today. I mean, he is almost 91 years old. He was the earlier he was the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, a great theorist of his generation, and the way he tried to work on the contributions of Durkheim, Weber and Marx. I think it is a seminal work in the 1970s. When he was barely 30, 32, 33 years old, he wrote Capitalism and Modern Social Theory. Okay? I mean, comparing the works of Durkheim, Weber and Marx. Okay? And it is a seminal work that it is a widely read, cited, referenced book, not simply in India or Great Britain, I mean United Kingdom, but across the continents. Okay? You go to any library, you will find a copy of Capitalism and Modern Social Theory, any library in the world. Okay? Giddens' reflections on modernity, Giddens' reflections on modernity can be examined through his reflections on time-space distanciation, duality of the structure, the problem of order and so on. Okay. If this is so, then now we are going to move on to how to synthesize modernity and social theory by Jürgen Habermas. Okay. Jürgen Habermas, of course, belongs to the tradition of critical theory and pragmatism. Okay. When I say critical theory, I refer to the Frankfurt School, the theorists of Frankfurt School in Germany. They are known as neo-Marxists. Okay. Habermas also is clubbed under neo-Marxist school. It is very important. I mean, if somebody may say that what are the differences then again between Marxism and neo-Marxism? Okay. Neo-Marxists especially try to operate at the level of a critique to positivism, scientism, critique to positivism, a critique to scientism, a critique to economism, that any argument, any phenomenon cannot be reduced to positivism, cannot be reduced to science, cannot be reduced to only economy. Okay? There cannot be positivistic reductionism, there cannot be scientific reductionism, or there cannot be economic reductionism. Okay? That is the critical thing. And when I say pragmatism, I mean it's an American tradition of pragmatism, I mean which is based on practical experience of human agency. Okay? And Habermas is noted for his work on the structural transformation of the public sphere. Habermas's work focuses on the foundations of social theory and epistemology. Epistemology, you know, body of knowledge or theory of knowledge, the central political philosophical questions which epistemology addresses. I mean, what is knowledge, what counts as knowledge, how is knowledge produced and so on. And Habermas's work focuses on the foundations of social theory and epistemology, the analysis of advanced capitalist societies and democracy, okay, the rule of law in a critical social evolutionary context, and contemporary politics, particularly German politics. Habermas's theoretical system is devoted to revealing the possibility of rationality, I mean the possibility of reason, emancipation, and not simply rationality, but rational critical communication, latent in modern institutions and in the human capacity to deliberate and pursue rational interests. Habermas is known for his work on the concept of modernity, particularly with respect to the discussions on rationalization originally set forth by Weber. Whilst influenced by American pragmatism, structural functionalism and even post-structuralism and postmodernism, many of the central tenets of Habermas's thought remain broadly Marxist in nature. Habermas has constructed a comprehensive framework of social theory and philosophy, drawing on a number of intellectual traditions, a number of theoretical traditions, namely the German philosophical thought of Immanuel Kant, Schelling, Hegel, Dilthey, Edmund Husserl and Gadamer. The Marxian tradition, both the theory of Karl Marx himself as well as the critical neo-Marxian theory of the Frankfurt School, that is Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse and so on. The sociological theories of Max Weber, Emil Durkheim and George Herbert Mead, the linguistic philosophy and speech act theories of Wittgenstein, Austin, Stawson, Tolmin and Searle, the development psychology of Piaget and Kohlberg, the American pragmatist tradition of Charles Sanders Peirce and Dewey, the sociological systems theory of Talcott Parsons and Luhmann and Neo-Kantian thought. We have already discussed Neo-Kantianism, Marxism and so on. I have discussed Weber. What is Neo-Kantianism? Our knowledge of the social world is a constructed one which involves selection and interpretation. Okay. We have discussed most of the things, but I am not going to discuss all these philosophies of Kant or Schelling or Hegel, Dilthey, Husserl, Gadamer and so on, because it will take this will be a completely different course altogether. What I am trying to focus on here is that how Habermas considers his major contribution to be the development of the concept and theory of communicative reason or communicative rationality, which distinguishes itself from the rationalist tradition by locating rationality in structures of interpersonal linguistic communication rather than in the structure of either the cosmos or the knowing subject. This is very important. And Habermas's social theory advances the goals of human emancipation while maintaining an inclusive universalistic moral framework. And such universalist, inclusive, universalistic moral framework rests on the argument called universal pragmatics, that all speech acts have an inherent teleology. Teleology means that it must have a goal, it must have an end. Okay? The goal of mutual understanding that the human beings possess the communicative competence to bring about such understanding. Okay? Habermas built the framework out of the speech act philosophy of Wittgenstein, Austin and Searle, the sociological theory of the interactional constitution of mind and self of Mead, and the theory of moral development of Piaget and Kohlberg, and the disclosure ethics of his Heidelberg colleague Appel, Karl Otto Appel. Okay? Okay. To give you an example, suppose what did Wittgenstein suggest? What can be said at all, what can be expressed at all, can be expressed very clearly, and what I cannot talk about, I must pass over in silence. Then the significance of communicative rationality is very important, communicative competence is very important to bring about such mutual understanding. Habermas's works resonate within the traditions of Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the Enlightenment and of democratic socialism, through which through his emphasis on the potential for transforming the world and arriving at a more human, just and equitable and egalitarian society through the realization of the human potential for reason, in part through discourse ethics. While Habermas has stated that the Enlightenment is an unfinished project, what is that Enlightenment? Why is it an unfinished project? Precisely because the Enlightenment, the way Habermas tried to visualize or foresee, okay, it must be the Enlightenment must aim at a more human, just, equitable and egalitarian society. Okay? While Habermas has stated that the Enlightenment is an unfinished project, He argues that it should be corrected and complemented, not discarded. In this, he distances himself from the Frankfurt School, criticizing it as well as much of postmodernist thought for excessive pessimism, misdirected radicalism and exaggerations. Okay? This is important. And within sociology, Habermas's contributions, okay, Habermas's major contribution was the development of a comprehensive theory of societal evolution and modernization, focusing on the difference between communicative rationality and rationalization on the one hand, and strategic and instrumental rationality and rationalization on the other. Okay? Instrumental rationality, who said? Max Weber. Communicative rationality, Habermas. Okay? Thereby, Habermas tried to look at the distinction between communicative rationality and rationalization on the one hand, and strategic or instrumental rationality and rationalization on the other. This includes a critique from a communicative standpoint of the differentiation based theory of social systems developed by Luhmann, a student of Talcott Parsons. His Habermas's defense of modernity and civil society has been a source of inspiration to others, and is considered a major philosophical alternative to the varieties of post-structuralism. He has also offered an influential analysis of late capitalism. Habermas, okay, when I say late capitalism, late modernity and so on, it is interesting. I mean to see these developments. When we look at this, okay, Habermas perceives the rationalization, humanization and democratization of society in terms of the institutionalization of the potential for rationality that is inherent in the communicative competence that is unique to the human species. This is very important. What is so unique to human species? I mean, the perception of rationalization, humanization and democratization of society in terms of the institutionalization of potential for rationality. How is it found? How can it be found? It can be found in the way in which we try to conceptualize communicative competence for mutual understanding, greater mutual understanding. Habermas contends that communicative competence has developed through the course of evolution, but in contemporary society it is often suppressed or weakened by the way in which major domains of social life such as the market, the state and organizations have been given over to or taken over by strategic or instrumental rationality, so that the logic of the system supplants that of the Lebenswelt or life world. Okay? Therein lies the significance of, I mean, when Habermas tries to deviate from instrumental rationality to communicative rationality and rationalization, okay, therein lies the significance of or therein lies the beauty of the ways in which he tried to dwell upon science. Okay. For him, it is not simply science, but reconstructive science. Okay. Habermas introduces the term reconstructive science with a double purpose. There is a dual purpose. There are two purposes. Number one, the purpose of reconstructive science is to place general theory of society between philosophy and social sciences, between abstract systems and concrete systems, between general systems and specific systems. And secondly, the purpose of reconstructive science is to re-establish the rift between great theorization and the empirical research. Okay? There must be, I mean, they must always, I mean, our experiences, our theories, they must interact with each other. There must be a tussle, otherwise we cannot have new theories. The model of rational reconstructions represents the main thread of the surveys about the structures of the world of life in terms of culture, society and personality and their respective functions, I mean in terms of cultural reproductions, social integrations and socialization. And for this purpose, the dialectic between symbolic representation of the structures subordinated to worlds of life, I mean internal relationships, okay, on the one hand, and the material reproduction of the social systems in the complex external relationships between social systems and environment has to be considered. Okay. This is very important. When Habermas was trying to dwell upon rational reconstructions, okay, I mean it represents the main thread of the surveys about the structures of the life world, on the one hand, okay, and their respective functions on the other. When he said structures of the world of life or life world, he referred to culture, society and personality. And the functions of those structures of the life world, when he said, he referred to cultural reproductions, social integrations as well as socialization. And when Habermas talked about the dialectic between symbolic representation of on the one hand and material reproduction on the other, I mean when symbolic representation of the structure subordinated to all worlds of life, I mean internal relationships, when he referred to material reproduction of the social systems in their complex systems, okay, he referred to the external relationships between social systems and environment. Okay. And this dialectic between symbolic representation and material reproduction of the social systems, okay, has to be considered. Okay. This model, I mean Habermas's model, finds an application above all in the theory of the social evolution, starting from the reconstruction of the necessary conditions for a phylogeny of the socio-cultural life forms, I mean the hominization until an analysis of the development of social formations, which Habermas divides into primitive, traditional, modern and contemporary formations. Okay. What are the key points, okay, that we have got in the context of all three, whether it is by Wallerstein or Giddens or Habermas, we are going to discuss in the next lecture. Okay. Now, what we have discussed very quickly, okay, we have discussed, I mean in this lecture we have discussed the distinctions between modernity and postmodernism, okay, the contributions made by, I mean on the basis of the distinctions between modernity and postmodernism, we have discussed the contributions made by Anthony Giddens and Jürgen Habermas. Anthony Giddens' reflections on the problem of order is one of time-space distanciation. I mean in that time and space are ordered in modernity to connect presence and absence. We have also discussed how these time-space distanciations or separations produce disembedding of traditional forms of relationships as standard and abstract dimensions of space and time, okay, come to order and rationalize activities in the place of local contexts. We have also discussed disembedding and disembedding mechanisms for Giddens, I mean which require the creation of symbolic tokens. Okay. I have also discussed trust, which arises from the lack of full information, which connotes reliability in the face of contingency, which operates as a link between faith and confidence, which involves principles rather than relying on the morality of others and so on. And how we have also discussed how Giddens dismisses anti-foundationalism in postmodernism. We have also discussed structuration theory, the duality of structure and so on. And then we moved on to Habermas, I mean how Habermas belongs to the tradition of critical theory and pragmatism, how he is well known for his work on the structural transformation of the public sphere. Okay. what are his intellectual influences, namely American pragmatism, structural functionalism, and even post-structuralism, though many of the central tenets of Habermas's thought remain broadly Marxist in nature. Okay. And when Weber was more concerned about instrumental rationality or strategic rationality or goal oriented social action or intentional human action, okay, Habermas was more concerned about communicative rationality and rationalization. And while Habermas stated that the Enlightenment is an unfinished project, he argues that it should be corrected and complemented, not discarded. In this, of course, Habermas distances himself from the Frankfurt School, criticizing it as well as much of postmodernist thought for excessive pessimism, misdirected radicalism, and exaggerations. Okay. In the next lecture, further Habermas also talked about reconstructive science, the purpose of which is to place the general theory of society between philosophy and social sciences, and also to re-establish the rift between the great theorization and the empirical research. Okay. And then the way Habermas talked about the model of rational reconstructions, which represents the main thread of the surveys about the structures of the world of life on the one hand, and the functions of those structures of the world of life on the other. And for this purpose, the dialectic between symbolic representation of the structures subordinated to all worlds of life on the one hand, and the material reproduction of the social systems in their complex, okay, has to be considered, and such model finds an application above all in the theory of the social evolution, starting from the reconstruction of the necessary conditions for a phylogeny of the socio-cultural life forms, the hominization until an analysis of the development of social formations, which Habermas subdivides into primitive, traditional, modern, and contemporary formations. Okay. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss the key points so far as the contributions of Wallerstein, Giddens, and Habermas are concerned. Thank you.